Okay, we'll continue with the study of Greg Bahnsen's book, Van Til's Apologetic. And we've reached chapter 4. It's always exciting milestone to start a new chapter. And in this chapter, it's clear that Greg Bahnsen is feeling his oats a bit because he's finally shifting to something a little closer to pure philosophy, namely, well, the title is The Epistemological Side of Apologetics, and epistemology was the area in which he wrote his PhD dissertation. And after all, we should remember that even though Bahnsen was very competent in theology, he didn't pick theology for his doctorate, he picked philosophy. So you can tell that he kind of is really enjoying churning up the material and being a little bit more creative as far as his own contribution goes in this chapter. And it's going to be, I think you could adequately summarize it as saying that he's going to be picking apart the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief to show how any approach to that question that purports to be neutral with regard to Christianity is in fact very non-neutral. And in fact, the dualities that are set in motion between justified versus not justified, truth and falseness even, types of approaches to epistemology, deductive versus inductive logic, that all of these dualisms are artificial and inadequate in view of the Christian revelation given by God. So with that kind of overview of where this chapter will be going, he starts off in this section talking about how the unbeliever and believer in fact are coming in with epistemological convictions, even about what the nature of truth, belief, meaning, etc. is, as he says at the bottom of 144. And he points out that even in the revelation of the New Testament, particularly, these disagreements are very evident. For instance, he mentions, middle of page 145, as the Christian knows from reading his Bible, men are divided by epistemological conflicts concerning such matters as the nature of truth, John 18:38, what is believable, Acts 26:8, the reliability of our senses, he gives 3 passages, the difference between knowledge and pseudo-knowledge, 1 Timothy 6:20, or between wisdom and folly, 1 Corinthians 1:18-29, and the evidential value and power of miracles, several passages. Then on page 146, he summarizes this by saying, if God exists and is as the Christian worldview claims, then his existence has an undeniable bearing on how we understand the process of knowing, the standards of truth and evidence, ultimate authority, and other crucial matters in epistemology. Of course, we've reached that same conclusion in earlier chapters, but I think he's setting the stage for a specific focus on epistemology. He continues on page 146 to reiterate that there's this ethical enmeshing of our project of knowledge, that it's inescapably ethical, and specifically it's inescapably either in submission to the Word of God or in rebellion. There's not like a neutral platform that's neither faithful nor unfaithful. All of this to set the stage for saying that we can't pretend to go to philosophy to kind of like be a neutral arbiter of what rules will follow for how to know things, as if the philosophy could provide that answer. And here what he does is he illustrates that on page 147 by outlining 2 basic approaches that philosophers take to this question of developing an epistemology. And it's kind of interesting because it's hard to, he doesn't identify what these 2 schools are. When I look at it, I could read it as the Anglo-Saxon American analytical tradition versus the more continental tradition. Or I could read it as sort of a realist versus, or a nominalist versus a realist view, or similarly a realist versus idealist view. He doesn't focus that, which I think is kind of creative. He's trying to give a more broad, not pigeonholing summary of how secular philosophers and Christian philosophers have their preliminary orientation on this question of knowledge. So let me read the two descriptions. The first: those who have emphasized that the world is comprised of separate and discontinuous things, sharply different in kind and number, have conceptualized thinking as an activity that occurs in the mind, with the basic problem being how to get independent minds into correspondence with independently existing objects outside the mind. And then the second one: by contrast, philosophers who have emphasized the similarities, unities, and continuities in the world, in which case different things blend together in the process of history and are basically different in degree, have conceptualized thinking as itself being the mind, whose reasoning develops and unfolds in continuity with all of man's faculties, e.g. perception, volition, imagination, and in connection with the object of knowledge itself. So I'm reading that second group as being the more continental, which would include phenomenology, existentialism, and really the whole German idealists, Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte. And idealists in general would probably be in the second category. And the first one is more your British empiricists, logical positivists, even the ordinary language school, the symbolic logic approach. So he continues, accordingly, for this second group, i.e. the more continental group of philosophers, the problem is not to explain how minds and objects correspond, for they are already inherently related, the differences between them being only of degree, but to explain how a finite mind can have a wide enough, inclusive enough system to know any particular or limited truth. These two different approaches to philosophy even see logic differently from each other. For the first, every statement must be neatly classified into one of two quite distinct categories, the consistent or the contradictory. For the second, such categories are merely tentative and provisional, standing in dynamic tension because of our limited conceptualizations, while we await progress toward more adequate integration of the various aspects of what we know. So, of course, Bahnsen's point here is going to be that even without bringing in the Van Tilian critique, we see that philosophy already doesn't have a unified perspective. It's unable to achieve like a unified platform from which to try to decide these questions of knowledge. So, in other words, the inability, the impossibility of neutrality can really already be seen just from familiarity with the literature. So he continues the last paragraph on 147. Arguments between these schools of thought have always been unrewarding just because their epistemological differences are a reflection of, and are coordinated with, their differences over the nature of reality. The first school, which emphasizes sharp differences and discontinuities, accuses the second school, which emphasizes differences of degree and continuities, of being muddled in their thinking and failing to draw clear contrasts, while the second school accuses the first of falsifying the whole truth by reductionism and oversimplification. Arguments between conflicting schools of philosophy, to put it simply, tend already to incorporate epistemological arguments concerning method, the proper kind of analysis, nature of truth, use of logic, etc. So that's as far as he takes it in section 1. He'll get more into some of these distinctions of belief and justification in subsequent chapters. So in this passage from Van Til, which Bahnsen gives the title, Neutrality as Anti-Theistic, Van Til is going to reestablish a point we've already discussed before as to how the fact that neutrality on these subjects of knowledge and epistemology is not neutral, and therefore not being neutral and not being theistic. It is anti-theistic, i.e. not just atheistic or agnostic. It's actually anti-theistic. And he's going to use as his foil for this discussion the question, were the Greek philosophers approaching the question of knowledge with sort of a childlike innocence? Like when we study the Milesians, should we think of these as like the first awakening of human consciousness in discussing the question of being, metaphysics? Or is it a little different than that? So, starting the last 6 lines on page 148, Van Til says, "The usual presentation is that the Greeks naturally began to look around them at the physical universe and to ask questions about it as a child asks questions about any strange or new thing that it sees. Hence, it is argued that no more than you would accuse a child of starting with an anti-theistic bias, should you accuse the Greeks of beginning with anything but an open mind. Naturally, they would begin with the things that were nearest to them, and only afterward could they pass on to the more remote questions of metaphysics. They began with physics and thereupon turned to metaphysics." Skipping a couple lines. "But this comparison would be fair only if anti-theism were true. The comparison presupposes that the human race was for the first time emerging into self-consciousness in the persons of the Greeks. The comparison takes for granted that the human race had never been in close contact with a God who is nearer to them than the universe. In other words, the comparison takes for granted that the physical facts would naturally be knowable first, and that if God is to be known, he must be known later. But this is exactly the point in dispute. If the theistic view is true, then man was originally as close to God as he was to any physical fact. If theism is true, man once realized the fact that the animals and the trees were known to him because God was known to him. If theism is true, the revelation of the absolute God was everywhere found in the created universe, so that no matter where man would turn, to himself or to nature about him, he would meet God. This is implied in the idea of creation. The idea of creation carries with it a definite view of being and of becoming, the two main questions of Greek philosophy. The Parmenidean solution being that their becoming is not possible because it leads to contradictions, so there's only static being, everything else is illusion. Heraclitus taking the opposite view that becoming is the only thing, there is no static being. And so this led to all of the discussions of the Greeks. I shouldn't say it led to, but these are like the two types of which Greek thought was wrestling. And you might recognize elements in the Hegelian dialectic. So this question of being and becoming inserts itself right up into the modern age. The idea of creation makes a distinction of being between God and man. Anyone holding to the idea of creation, we speak of temporal, not logical creation, must also hold to the idea of a God who existed apart from the world and had meaning for himself apart from the world. So when he distinguishes logical and temporal creation, he's trying to distinguish between a view that the Greeks, the pagan Greeks, might have held to the unmoved mover eternally creating the universe logically, because the universe needs some foundation to rest on, but not temporal. So in other words, the universe was of infinite duration in their mind. None of them could escape that belief. So Van Til is emphasizing the fact that the Christian doctrine of creation is creation in time, or better said, with Augustine, time is created with the rest of the creation. So what Van Til has set up here is that the Christian view already rejects the Greek notion of being by distinguishing between the creator and creature. in a more radical and fundamental way than any Greeks that might have had a formal concept of God as the creator or the unmoved mover. So he continues, and this point goes counter to the first assumption of Greek speculation spoken of, that all things are at bottom one. So the oneness of being, as opposed to, as he continues here, if theism is right, all things are at bottom two, not one, creator and creature. For the Greeks, all things are at bottom one. In the second place, anyone holding to the idea of creation must also hold that the world of becoming cannot be taken for granted as an ultimate with which, as a given, the human mind must begin its speculation. Thus, the creation idea also runs counter to the second and third assumptions of Greek philosophy, that the fact of change, or becoming, should be taken for granted, and that the manifold generated from the one is all the while identical with the one. So here he's calling the world of becoming, which brings in diversity and particularity and so forth, as being a manifold. And that's kind of a consequence of the becoming. And the third premise that Van Til is highlighting here is that this becoming manifold of diversity is the same as the oneness of the totality. So again, it's sort of interesting. It's sort of similar to the Hegelian dialectic, first dialectic that I talked about several videos ago, with the emphasis on the immanence. So the Greek has this notion of oneness of being as such, but we need something, except for Parmenides, we need some principle to explain the diversity. So somehow the being manifests itself diversely into the manifold, but that manifold is itself part of the oneness. And so you have this dialectical tension that's resolved in various ways with various thinkers, but yet it's all in principle this one being, in distinction from the Christian view that starts off with, you might say, a dualism, but to avoid even the term dualism, just keeping the creator-creature distinction in mind. Distinguishing the Greek and the Christian views. So just to nail down the three assumptions that Van Til highlights in Greek philosophy on page 149, this would be the first assumption, the being. The second assumption is the becoming, or the diversification. And then the third assumption was the fact that the diversity is the same or identical to the one that started off with. Continuing, now Van Til is going to contrast the Greek way of apprehending reality with the biblical view, the bottom of page 149. We should add that according to Scripture, God spoke to man at the outset of history. In addition to revealing himself in the facts of the created universe, God revealed himself in words, telling man about what he should do with the facts of the universe. Since the fall, all men, as fallen in Adam, continue to be responsible for this twofold revelation of God given to man at the beginning of history. From these considerations, it follows that if theism is true, the Greeks are not a race of innocent children just beginning to look around in the world. If theism is true, there has been an original monotheism, or as we may now say, an original theism from which the race has fallen away. This truth is usually given no more serious thought than one of the myths of the Greeks. So the secular historians speak of, the origin of monotheism and the birth of monotheism. And the Bible's account would be a myth created by this tribe known as the Hebrews to try to explain, in much the same way as the Greeks were trying to explain things. Van Til is saying, well, no, in the Christian worldview, what you call a myth is actually the literal story of humankind in its beginning. And that beginning, which had the Word of God presented to its founders, Adam and Eve, right from the get-go, has stamped the human consciousness with that history and that origin, so that to now subsequently pretend to be interpreting in this neutral way is actually rebellious. So he goes on to explicate further, how that position is antithetical, as we've talked about before, so I won't go ahead and read everything. And then in the middle on page 151, he says, a Christian will engage in no speculation. Footnote 8. Bahnsen says, Van Til means here that the Christian worldview and its interrelated aspects of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics is not developed by standing outside a commitment to God's revelation and attempting by neutral reasoning to arrive at a satisfactory conception of knowledge, reality, and moral behavior abstracted, mentally separated from each other. The believer does not speculate in general, but submits to the concrete and detailed information revealed by God about reality, knowledge, and ethics. So I wish Bahnsen had expanded on that point a little further, because, of course, there's a place for speculation within the Christian's worldview. For example, just to give a topic that I've given a great deal of thought to, whether the world, the created world, granted that God created the world, is the temporal nature of that world more like the A theory or the B theory that philosophers have discussed? Namely, is there presentism such that only that which exists in the world is that which exists now? Or is the world in all of its temporal moments simultaneously existent, and then you have to account for the fact that we experience it temporally, the B theory? I believe there's room for a Christian philosopher to speculate, if you will, between those two views, or perhaps propose a third way of modeling it. So when Van Til says the Christian refuses to speculate, we have to remember that what he means is the Christian should not speculate in an untethered way. In other words, in a way that would contradict what we know to be the case from God's revelation. Continuing, Van Til. A Christian will engage in no speculation. He has no metaphysics as metaphysics is usually understood. He does not even start his thinking with God as his master concept in order to deduce his system of truth from this master concept. His thinking is always and only an attempt to integrate the various aspects of biblical teaching. In doing so, he is deeply conscious of the fact that every concept he employs must be limited by every other concept he employs, and that therefore his system is an effort to restate in his confession the truth as it is in Jesus. And then he continues to drive home that the opposite view is anti-theist and non-neutral. And I just wanted to read one sentence in the middle of that paragraph that I found quite striking. Middle of paragraph. And such a God would not feel very kindly disposed to those who ignore him. Even in human relationships, it is true that to be ignored is a deeper source of grief to him who is ignored than to be opposed. And I think that's an extremely insightful remark, because we've all felt it, right? When as a child you suffered the punishment of being ignored by your siblings or friends or classmates, far worse than if they had challenged you to fisticuffs. And this alone is when people say, well, I'm a good guy. I've struggled to live a good life. What would God find fault with me? Just this simple answer is devastating. But you've spent your whole life ignoring God when his revelation is all around you, but yet you just live your life trying to be a good boy, completely ignoring God. I mean, for that alone, he could judge you and condemn you. So continuing with the Van Til on page 152, he launches into another exposition of Eve's situation, which we've done once before, but with a slightly different focus here. And of course, this is important because of his point that the history of man's relation to God, in contrast to what the defender of the Greek philosophy would say, involved knowledge of God right from the get-go. And that's why this digression on the situation of Eve is appropriate. Van Til. The narrative of the fall of man may illustrate this point. Adam and Eve were true theists at the first. They took God's interpretation of themselves and of the animals for granted as the true interpretation. Then came the tempter. He presented to Eve another, that is, an anti-theistic theory of reality, and asked her to be the judge as to which was the more reasonable for her to accept. And the acceptance of this position of judge constituted the fall of man. I myself feel that as we read further, ask yourself the question, was the posture of hypothetically considering the tempter's proposal, like even listening for a moment, seems to be what Van Til is saying constituted the fall of man, whereas I would like to let the eating of the apple be an integral part of the story. Van Til seems to be saying that whether she went ahead and ate the apple would be neither here nor there. The fall already had occurred. So let's continue reading a bit and then maybe come back to that question. And the acceptance of this position of judge constituted the fall of man. That acceptance put the mind of man on an equality with the mind of God. That acceptance also put the mind of the devil on an equality with God. Before Eve could listen to the tempter, she had to take for granted that the devil was perhaps a person who knew as much about reality as God knew about it. Before Eve could listen to the tempter, she had to take it for granted that she herself might be such a one as to make it reasonable for her to make a final decision between claims and counterclaims that involved the entire future of her existence. That is, Eve was obliged to postulate an ultimate epistemological pluralism and contingency before she could even proceed to consider the proposition made to her by the devil. Or, otherwise expressed, Eve was compelled to assume the equal ultimacy of the minds of God, of the devil, and of herself, and this surely excluded the exclusive ultimacy of God. This, therefore, was a denial of God's absoluteness epistemologically. Thus, neutrality was based upon negation. Neutrality is negation. The way I would resolve this question as to whether the eating of the apple was the fall or the prior intellectual positing of neutrality would be to say that the Cartesian notion of an infinitesimally small point of time is not a proper way to analyze history or human experience, but rather moments. Moments are kind of elastic. Sometimes a moment is very brief, a fraction of a second, and other times a moment is many seconds, even minutes perhaps, or longer. And the moment is that which encompasses how a finite creature coalesces in thinking and acting. And thinking has a prior, a current, and anticipated aspect to it. You know, to be temporal means that we live in the now, but the now would be meaningless without having a memory of the immediate past or an anticipation of the immediate future. And so somewhere where you draw a finite boundary around the past, present, and future defines a moment. And so I would say that the event of the fall of man included the eating of the apple as a culminating boundary And the putting herself in that position of being the judge and therefore negating God's authority is part of that same moment. So that you couldn't ever imagine Eve truly putting herself in the position of judge with affirmation without taking the apple, nor eating the apple without that prior emotion having taken place. But I do think we need to try to preserve the story because the story is important. Continuing, skipping a couple sentences. Eve was definitely placed before an either-or alternative. Of course, she would have denied this if you had told her so at the time. She would have resented being placed before any such alternative. She naturally thought that the issue was not irrevocable, but that she could experiment with the satanic attitude for a while. And if it did not seem to work, she could turn back to her old position of theism again. She thought that evil or sin was at the worst a stepping stone to higher things, and that she could do all the stepping herself. In all this she was quite wrong. Whether she liked it or not, she was, as a matter of fact, standing before an exclusive alternative. Only an action proceeding from the bosom of the eternal could place her on the right track again. That latter point is indicating that once fallen, only God can condescend to provide a way of redemption or coming back. Like, you've lost your ability at that point to crawl back out of the hole and just resume as if nothing had happened. However, Van Til, I think, betrays the thing I'm talking about in the previous sentence where he says, whether she liked it or not, she was, as a matter of fact, standing before an exclusive alternative, which implies that she was standing before it, but not yet having taken that fatal path. So I want to say that Eve was capable of apprehending the tempter's proposal without stepping into it and without having sinned. Apprehending what the serpent was saying could have been apprehended without sin. So I guess maybe the analogy might be, if you walked up to a cliff before you realized it was a cliff and you look over and you're questioning, well, I wonder, can I fly? Can I just step over this? And let's say the law that God had given was that, no, you can't fly, don't step over a cliff. But now that thought crosses your mind. Has the mere fact that the thought crossed your mind does that an entailment of the sin and the fall? No, I would say that apprehending it was not. Jumping over would mean that choice had been made. So I think this is consistent with what Van Til is teaching, I hope. That would be my view on this question. Skipping a couple paragraphs on page 153. When Eve listened to the tempter, she therefore not only had to posit an original epistemological pluralism, but also an original metaphysical pluralism. She had to take for granted that as a time-created being, she could reasonably consider herself to be sufficiently ultimate in her being so as to warrant an action that was contrary to the will of an eternal being. That is, she not only had to equalize time and eternity, but she had to put time above eternity. It was in time that Satan told her the issue was to be settled. He said that it still remained to be seen whether God's threats would come true. The experimental method was to be employed. Only time could tell. This attitude implied that God was no more than a finite God. If he were thought of as an absolute, it would be worse than folly for a creature of time to try out the interpretation of God in the test tube of time. If he were thought of as eternal, such an undertaking was doomed to failure, because in that case history could be nothing but the expression of God's will, and in that case man's humanity would be destroyed. So despite my minor criticism or modification, I do think that this reflection on the situation of Eve is clever and insightful and helpful. He continues here and makes sort of a similar point that we talked about several videos ago with the situation of the writer Singer. And Singer's proposed epistemological neutrality. And I showed on the board how that wherever Christian theism implies something contradictory to Singer, then it can't be the case that Singer is actually starting off in a neutral posture. So Van Til continues, last paragraph of page 153. It is true that this story of man's fall is cast away as a relic of mythological age by the average student of philosophy. But surely this is unjust. The question is not merely one of the historicity of the book of Genesis. It is that, but it is also more than that. The whole philosophy of theism is involved in it. Anyone rejecting the Genesis narrative must also be prepared to reject the idea of an absolute God. The history includes the philosophy, and the philosophy includes the history. Or we may say that those who reject the Genesis narrative begin their investigation of Greek philosophy with a definite anti-theistic bias. So again, here's where it's coupling into his general critique, which can be made from a number of different angles to show that the secular approach to philosophy is not neutral but anti-theistic. It is only because they are themselves not neutral that they claim the Greeks to have been neutral. It is an example of identification of neutrality with a fundamental anti-theistic bias. And as Christian theists, we do not at all wonder at this. It is just what we would expect. The fact that present-day anti-theistic philosophers seem to be totally unaware of their bias and constantly insist that their starting point is that of neutrality is itself the best possible proof of the complete control the bias has of them. Skipping a couple sentences, then the more necessary it is that we challenge this colossal assumption at the outset when it is applied to the study of the Greeks. So to summarize, this is an interesting passage purportedly about the study of Greek philosophy, but where Van Til uses that to make some points about neutrality and the history of man, starting with Adam and Eve, which had verbal revelation as well as natural revelation. So I guess the question maybe an opponent might make would be, even though the Greeks are descended from Adam and Eve, could they not have forgotten that original story and now, thousands of years later, be starting like children with a clean slate, where they're groping in sort of an ethically neutral kind of way? And Van Til is clearly denying that that is the case, which implies to me that this is an assertion that our history is baked into our consciousness, or if not our consciousness, our being as persons. So our personhood takes up the entire history of humanity, even if it's tacit knowledge that's not fully conscious. And I think that this is a very satisfactory thesis. You could probably frame it in terms of covenantal imputation, that Adam and Eve's sin was simply imputed to subsequent generations. But I think what Van Til is saying that, if you scratch below the surface, there is sort of this tacit knowledge that affects, if not knowledge, at least an effect that steers the movement of the soul when he exercises reason to try to understand, and it's not neutral. I think this thesis that we're enmeshed in our history, even our primal history, and that determines, we kind of recapitulate that history in the very form of our consciousness, is an interesting one and an important one and a true insight. And perhaps I think it'll become more clear, the plausibility of that thesis, as we continue with the other Van Til readings. However, I see the time is already running late, so I'm going to stop at this point for this week and continue with the other two Van Til readings from section 4.1 next time. See you then.